Welcome to Conversations with CISOs, Security Leaders and Technology Executives, where we sit down with the leaders shaping cybersecurity and enterprise technology. Today, I'm joined by Brett Price to discuss what security leaders should focus on during their first 12 months. Brett, thank you for joining me today. To get started, could you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background and your current role?
Sure. My name is Brett Price. I've been in the business probably about 25 years, maybe a little more. Started out swapping out printers and fixing PCs, and gradually moved to system admin, and then network admin, routers and switches, and got into security shortly thereafter. So I did that worked at a healthcare organization for about 7 years, and then routing and switching started to get a little redundant, a little boring. So I figured I'd take on the security world, and so I got into mostly Cisco. Got a bunch of certifications: MCSE, CCNA, CCNP, CCDA. All those, not the CCIE, but worked for Verizon Enterprise Security Solutions for another 7 years. I was a senior engineer working mostly on Cisco firewalls, proxies, did some checkpoint stuff, a few other different vendors with firewalls on the Fortune 50, mostly Fortune 20, 50, right around there, larger organization, firewall management. And then kind of got burnt out doing that, so I took on a advisory role at Verizon. So I was a senior advisor, security advisor, again staying within like the Fortune 50. Did that for a couple of years and then moved to the vendor side. So I took a role at Qualys as a technical account manager. Worked there for 5.5 years, worked my way up to VP of Sales, Regional Vice President, and then ended up taking a job as a consultant at a cybersecurity consulting firm. I built the CISO program there. I built the NIST assessment program, the CMMC, ISO, a few programs. And one of my engagements was virtual CISO for a company out of Charlotte, North Carolina. So I was their virtual CISO pretty much full time. They're a global public company, so there was a lot of GDPR, ISO certification for one of our partners, and Sarbanes-Oxley and PCI. And in January of this year, they hired me on full-time as their global CISO.
Excellent. Okay, so seeing as you have just become this CISO this year, this question should be pertinent. What do you believe the first 90 days should look like as a CISO?
So the first 90 days, I think one of the most important things is starting to build relationships. Right, understanding the culture is critical. And understanding leadership, a lot of it depends on where you sit in the hierarchy. So where you sit, are you reporting to the CEO? I report directly to the CEO. Do you report to the CIO? A lot of it depends, but building those relationships, understanding the culture is critical. All this while you're actually understanding crown jewels, understanding how the business operates, identifying crown jewels, and then assessing the risk around those crown jewels. So, while you're doing that, you're interviewing individuals, asking them about their business, about their portion of the business, how they manage their business, etc. And then you're learning about the organization, and you identify the crown jewels, which are the most critical systems with the most critical data to the business. In other words, what would impact the business most if that portion of the business were to be shut down? So that's what I consider crown jewels. whether it's cloud, whether it's on premise or what, it doesn't really matter, but identifying the crown jewels. And then identifying the top risks, right? So you can list it as the top 5 risks or whatever that you consider to be high risk. And then looking for quick wins. So first 90 days, you should identify some quick wins, things that you can mitigate or remediate within that first 90 days. Obviously, gaping holes within the security posture are critical. So, building relationships, understanding who the leaders are, understanding what the crown jewels are, and then getting those quick wins. While you're doing this, obviously you want to document everything. So I document what your risks are, document top 5 top risks. And when I say risks, again, what I'm talking about is I'm talking about what would impact the business the worst from a quantitative perspective, right? So the way that I manage my relationship with senior leadership is discussing business impacting situations. And with the business impacting situations, that means how much would it hurt the business from a quantitative perspective if X were to be taken offline, right? And then discussing things like what would the reputational damage be? What would it cost us to bring in a forensics investigation team? What would potential fines be, or potential litigations due to lost data and that sort of thing? Within that first 90 days as well, while you're identifying key individuals within the organization, you definitely want to put together an incident response plan. So the incident response plan doesn't have to be all that detailed, but you have to understand who the key players are. So you want to understand who the CEO is, who the CFO is, who's chief legal counsel, who's HR, and start developing relationships with your local FBI special agent of the cyber division. Understanding that, who, from a compliance perspective, who do you have to report to in the event of an incident, whether it be the Department of Homeland Security, or whether it be the Department of Health and Human Services, or the Data Privacy Office in the UK, say, for GDPR. So, and then starting to develop metrics.
Got it. So what would you say the biggest mistake new security leaders make during their first year is?
One of the biggest mistakes, I think, is not building relationships, right? And I emphasize this a lot, because the worst thing for a CISO to have happen is pushback. So if you don't understand the culture and you haven't built the relationships, then you're going to get pushback. You're going to get negative responses from some of the things that you're trying to accomplish. So that's probably one of the biggest things. And I guess another issue would be that not being able to articulate your technical findings in a business manner, in language that the business can understand. So I guess there's 2.
So you've talked a lot about building relationships within your first 90 days. What does a good relationship between a CISO and the rest of the executive team look like?
So it's a mutual understanding, and 2, it's being able to communicate, again, in business terms. So the CEO wants to build revenue, and avoid certain risks related to revenue. not necessarily cybersecurity risks. So if you can have conversations in a business sense related to cybersecurity, then it helps a lot. If you can convey that you are here to help improve processes, procedures, efficiencies, effectiveness, ways that can add to revenue generation or assist with revenue generation. Those are the better relationships.
So, as far as presenting risk in those business terms and focusing on supporting, the business's goals, what are some ways that you found are an effective way for that CISOs can use to communicate that?
So again, I try to incorporate quantitative risk. So building metrics, obviously you're going to have your metrics, your MTTRs, MTTDs, and your vulnerability management and your training, your security awareness training, but really trying to quantify those top 5 risks and including those in those metrics really helps. And a lot of it is an education. You may have to, excuse me, a lot of times it's baby steps, so you have to pick and choose. And you have to understand that if you're coming in as say a first time CISO or the company's first CISO, then chances are those senior leaders are not going to understand cybersecurity. They're certainly not going to understand the technical language. So making sure that you have those metrics that can communicate, that they can understand.
Okay. So, in over the course of your first 90 days as a CISO, you're building relationships. You're learning how to communicate risk to business stakeholders. If as a CISO in your first 90 days you identify some areas you want to change, at what point would a CISO know that they've earned enough trust to start trying to drive those bigger changes and get that executive buy-in?
Well, it depends because it depends on the level of risk, right? The buy-in may take time, a long time. It may take a year for you to build that true level of trust where you can say, hey, I have an issue here that I need to mitigate. I need this solution, and without a whole lot of explanation, they approve it. But if it's a top risk, then you have to communicate it in those business terms, or you have to make sure that you've communicated very well to the business that there is a level of risk acceptance, that they're willing to take. So you need sign off on the fact that if we cannot mitigate this solution or remediate this issue, vulnerability, say, or whatever, because we don't have a vulnerability management program, then it's up to senior leadership to completely understand the risk and then sign off on that risk.
So when a CISO comes into a new organization, obviously every organization is going to have their vulnerabilities, compliance requirements. They may have technical debt, different strategic projects going on that are competing for attention. As CISOs are working through identifying these different risks and these different scenarios that can impact the business, how do they determine what deserves focus first?
So I would say exploitability. Threat intelligence has a lot to do with it. So I monitor threat intelligence every day. So take, for instance, you identify a competitor that has just been breached because of the threat actor exploited XYZ vulnerability, right? That should be at the top of your list if you have XYZ vulnerability, for sure. So it's those wide open holes. If you have an S3 bucket with public access, those are critical to patch immediately. And then prioritize based on that level of risk, I would say. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Oh, yeah.
So after your first year as a CISO, what outcomes would you say would tell you if you've made meaningful progress in risk reduction?
So I guess, because we build those metrics and because we build our strategic plan, checking off some of those top risks, the exploitable things, the wide open S3 buckets, and those types of things. Success would also be your level of communication to the business. Are you still open? Is the business still open to freely communicate with you? Are you making progress with the CEO and the executive leadership team? Are they more educated than they were yesterday? Have you implemented a uh, a security awareness training program that actually the organization adopts and is not pushing back on? Things like that. Policies, is the business adhering to your policies, or are they reading and accepting your policies? Those types of things, because you can get a sense of how well the security program is being accepted by the responses that you get on some of those things, whether it be policy adherence, policy acceptance, security awareness training, reducing your exploitable vulnerabilities, and helping the business to adapt to, say, artificial intelligence, and those types of things are big wins.
So after your first 12 months, if you've looked back as a CISO and you see that some of these areas aren't improving, you don't have a security awareness training program that's been adopted heavily, you're not reducing vulnerabilities at the rate that you'd like to, you're having problems with AI adoption, etc. What are some things that CISOs could look to change within their next 12 months to mitigate some of those issues?
I was immediately going to say get a new CISO, but no, I think again it comes down to communication, right? So if those types of things aren't working, then you didn't start at the top, so you didn't get executive leadership buy-in and support. So the way that you are presenting to the leadership team, there is probably a gap. You're probably being over technical. You're probably putting too much emphasis on the bigger picture as opposed to just being very specific. So, I think changing the way that you present to executive leadership or you present to the business and interact with the business is probably going to be a key point for you moving forward.
Okay. So our last question, and I think I know what your answer is probably going to be. If you could give a new security leader one piece of advice for their first year, what would it be?
Dumb down the technical mumbo jumbo. Learn to speak in business terms. And, with that, start adopting quantitative risk, because I've been saying this for years. It's coming, where more and more CEOs, executive leaders, are being held accountable for data breaches. They're paying a lot closer attention to cybersecurity. And so with that, they're going to expect more. Whereas before, you could say, there's a level. This is a high severity issue that needs to be mitigated. And they say, why? And you say, because I'm the CISO and I've been doing this a long time. Nowadays, that doesn't fly. What does this mean to the business? What is the impact to the business if this were to materialize? Those types of things.
Well, thank you very much. It sounds like every CISO within the first 90 days needs to be building relationships and quantifying risk. Thank you everybody for watching. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to like, subscribe, leave a comment. And thanks again to Brett Price for joining us. And we'll see you guys in the next episode.
Thank you.